Just a recap, in my previous recordings on literature review, I looked at literature review by looking at how senior researchers who have published these literature review papers have conducted their literature review, and then I gave a lecture which sort of summarizes some of the routine concepts associated with literature review. I would like now to move towards concluding this topic and find a way to give a nice exit to, or a nice end to the topic. So the last thing I would want to do would be to look at what is termed the systematic literature review. And on your screen, you see an example of a published paper, which was published in the ACM Computing Surveys. Like all the other previous papers I have looked at, they were published by or in the ACM Computing Surveys, which is a journal, a prominent journal that publishes literature reviews from various forms. This paper is on sentiment analysis, which is a very important topic in computational linguistics. But you would classify this as the higher end research area in computational linguistics, mainly because by the time you reach sentiment analysis, you would have attained some of the low level tasks like spell checking, grammar checking, and all that stuff. So this is really the top end of the research in computational linguistics. And interestingly, this topic is focused on a natural environment, sentiment analysis for the natural environment. So it's a highly focused topic, but this is a systematic literature review. So we will be interested in understanding what a systematic literature review is and why is it called systematic. This paper was published this year in the journal ACM Computing Surveys. You can see that it was the publishers, the authors are from the Departamento di Informatica, Università degli Studi di Torino, Italy. That was my attempt to read Italian. Of course, I'm being informed by my own language. I don't know whether an Italian, if they listen to that, that could make sense to them in terms of the pronunciation. But this, I'm not sure whether this is the University of Torino. I've known prominent researchers, especially in the area of AI for healthcare or health informatics. I have had the pleasure of working with quite a number of researchers from the University of Torino. What I'm not sure is whether this particular university, because you need to see the English name to check if it is the right university, where I had a number of colleagues who did research there. Right, it is important to note here that I'm not going to look closely at the topic itself. I'm more interested in their methodology. How did they conduct the literature review? Of course, if you look at the abstract, they are performing a systematic literature review, and they are basing it on Kitchenham's framework, which as or guides in performing to explore, for instance, what tasks, techniques, benchmarks exist for sentiment analysis. So but the focus, of course, is the natural environment. They also, similar to Professor Norman Fenton, they have come up with some dimensions, what they call, there are 7 dimensions, which focus on a few areas like contribution, topical focus, data source and query, annotation, language, detail of the task, technology or algorithm used. So these are some of the 7 dimensions. Of course, this approach is always very important. You look at the domain, look at some of the aspects that you are looking at. You can call them dimensions, like Professor Norman Patton, not Fenton. Professor, I always confuse this name. Of course, there is Professor Norman Fenton and Professor Norman Patton. So the one I am referring to is Professor Norman Patton, right? So he had at least 2 papers where literature review, they formulate some dimensions that they are interested in, and then they do their literature review with respect to, in other words, they assess, analyze each literature by using these dimensions, right? They are, of course, looking at the growth of the research area on sentiment analysis for natural environment within the last few years, and of course, they hope the findings are expected to be significant, especially with respect to exposing the challenges, what has been achieved, and the challenges that still need to be addressed. Again, you can see that this literature review also aims at exposing the research gaps, which means those who want aspire to do research in sentiment analysis, specifically for this particular area, they could take a look at the challenges that have been identified in this particular case. So that's the research what I'm particularly interested in. So I would like now to take a look at some of the maybe just for interest sake, let's look at the research questions that they are interested in looking at. You can see that, right. So there are 2 main research questions that they are interested in. The first one is, what are the tasks, techniques, benchmark in sentiment analysis on natural environments, in natural environment topics? And the second question is, what are the challenges of sentiment analysis in the natural environment domain compared to general domain? So those are 2 broad questions. They are broad questions, and given that the write-up itself ended up being 37 pages, it means that these are the major questions, right? They are, of course, using the methodology, Kitchenham's methodology. We will look at this methodology later on, and they did provide a reference published by Picham. We will look at that paper and see what. Now they also identify contributions. What I might call if you haven't seen it, these are the expected contributions. So to answer research question 1, they comprehensively analyze and summarize the findings of 7 major dimensions. So it's quite an interesting area. And also they did compare the findings within the task, techniques, and benchmark with other literature reviews as well. Of course, if they achieve these, they are more or less like objectives, isn't it? So they are, of course, interested in something like a more systematic and selection process. They introduce what they call a natural language processing framework, implemented in Python for downloading and filtering papers that follows Kishima framework. Oh, I will be interested in looking at this Python framework here, which they introduced. They also made publicly available the Python implementation of this framework, which provide a further contribution. Yeah, I would definitely take a look at this. Um, so, of course, it's interesting that they developed a Python tool that can assist them to select some of the right papers, in order to make sure that the process itself is uh, is repeatable and so I'm actually we are within our research group initiating research that might very well be interested in that Python implementation. Python, of course, is one of the languages that I'm using for most of my development work. Even some of the development that I'm doing for some companies around the world, it's based on. I use Python a lot, and Python can also be a web framework, by the way. So I'm particularly interested in this particular area of their work. Right, now I will now jump to another section of their work that I would like you to pay attention to. This is the literature, the methodology section. The methodology section, which of course specify that it is using Kitchenham, a systematic literature review framework. And Kitchenham did publish a guideline. I think it's supposed to be 2007, and we will look at what it says. But it includes, here they summarize Kitchenham, of course, the various steps. The first one being selection of database sources, and then the definition of the queries that you run on each database, and also the paper selection stage, and the definition of the focuses of the analysis. Of course, this is just an outline of that particular methodology. But they give a very comprehensive methodology section. This helps, of course, for the work to be. That's what we mean by systematic. It means it clearly followed a well laid out procedure. And that is very important when we call something very systematic. Right. So here, of course, looking at their methodology, they cover sources and keywords. That is a very important part of any research process. And right, there is one thing that I would like to draw your attention to, and this is what they have described here. I'm not going to go into the details, but this is called Peacock. Right. So for defining the query to be based, to be used to find papers that may be relevant with respect to natural environment, natural environment topics be given by the European Molecular Biology Laboratory and the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, they followed what they call the PEACOck. The PEACOck, which is an acronym for Population, Intervention, Context, Outcome, and Comparison. And this is, of course, defined in the particular domain. And they base some kind of an experiment on the Peacock, which defined their queries based on some of these aspects that you might see here. Let me see if I can find that quite clearly. Let me. Right, if you look at that, they still describe in terms of their search terms based on Peacock. It is quite useful. But this is domain specific, of course. They are just described, they looked into their area and looked for some standards, some frameworks which they can use. So this is domain specific because they are focusing on the natural environment. So it's quite normal for them to look to the European Molecular Biology Laboratory and the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, which look at the natural environment. So that's, I don't need to emphasize on that aspect because it's really domain specific. What we are interested in here is they do come up with queries that are of interest in their case. They directly, they are using, they are focusing their work on these key databases, the ACM Digital Library. I always use that, the IEEE Explore, and also Springer Open. If you look at Springer Open and this Corpus, usually these ones, you don't miss much research papers that have been published. If you search, run your query across all these four, it's very rare to come across just one place where you can find all those. Right. Now, they then define their terms, the search terms, and construct a search query using Boolean operators, as you can see in number 2. Notice also that the end operators are very important. Right. It is also possible to run your query across some of these other databases, just to make sure that you don't miss out on a very important paper. So, of course, they do come up with some kind of a process in which defines the various stages where they come up with the various aspects, especially the inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is actually very important. The inclusion and exclusion criteria, which is laid out here. In fact, whenever you are doing a literature search and selection, especially once you have done your search and you have a large database of papers that you have found, you need to clearly define why you include papers or exclude papers, and you need to clearly define that. So it does take place in stages. The first stage is you exclude things that are not research papers that might come out of the query, and papers duplicated in a single source, so duplication of always happen, and also more than 10 years passed from publication, which means you are limiting all papers to 10 years. That's the exclusion criteria. That does eliminate a lot of papers. And then after stage 2, they now look at title and abstract selection. The paper duplicated across different sources. Survey papers are excluded. Papers not specifying relevance criteria are also excluded. And of course, the ones that are included are the ones that meet relevant criteria. And stage 3, of course, that stage 2 eliminates some papers as well. Stage 3 is now full text selection, where it meets the paper quality for inclusion, and you also exclude survey papers. Papers not specifying the quality criteria can also be eliminated. Poor quality papers, which are poorly written, can be excluded. So after that, you remain with some kind of an entire process. Right, I don't wish to, these are just the stages that they look at. So I will not go into the details of that. Right, of course, they do give another table that give obviously a more detailed inclusion relevance criteria. It's now expanding. They were talking about relevant criteria, isn't it? And now they are sort of expanding the relevant criteria to include some of the works that we have seen, of course. For instance, here this table give much more detailed. It's just a blow up of the criteria they were indicating. And remember, they haven't even started presenting their results. This is their methodology. and it's systematic in that you can see the process they used to come up with the selected papers. Of course, after this, these guys are going to come up with to proceed with now the literature focus, right? Of course, they are starting by, so in order to answer our research questions, we analyze 7 dimensions, those dimensions that we mentioned, in the papers that we selected according to the criteria described in the previous section. And the dimensions that we analyzed in the final selection of papers were the following. In other words, you assess each paper based on the same dimensions that are applied to each paper. And that process is obviously very important. So that they start, of course, with the contribution. After that, they also proceed to look at other dimensions: topical focus, data source and query, annotation, annotation language. Of course, these have got particular significance in the whole domain, so it's important to see that. So they're still explaining the methodology, and here they give us a paper, a diagram, just to show you much more closely what the diagram says. It clearly shows, let me go, it clearly shows that they have sources list, which are those databases, right? And they check if they can do advanced search feature. I think in most of those databases I have done advanced searches. If it's if it's no, they generate the search links automatically, and if yes, they generate the search links manually, and then you come up with a list of search links, and after that the paper links from the search links are collected. Normally, what they mean by search links is that you can run a query, but sometimes your query can lead to a link, a full link, such that if you access that link, you get a list of papers. And I think that's a good approach, because you can give that link to anybody, and when they access that, like a URL, you see the papers that they included. Of course, the paper changes from year to year because more papers are being published that qualify for that search. So search links are quite useful. Once you create a search term and you run a search query, and some sources will give you a search link. Right. Then after that, you collect the papers and you go through the entire process through this flowchart. So now, after that, I think they are almost done in terms of telling us what they want, and they now do the literature review, which is paper selection result. Here they are showing, okay, once we apply this process, what will be the result of their paper selection, and that might be is what they are covering here. Of course, they have given us a very interesting methodology, and of course, when you report results of applying your criteria, you can actually present a table like this one, which gives you results of the stages of selecting until you come up with the number that you want. For instance, at the end of stage 3, they come up with 51 papers. I think they end up including 51 papers. Right, so they are indicating in each library how many papers they come up with, how many papers they dropped, and so on, and the quality papers that come up. For instance, ACM Digital, they found 71 papers, but end up with 3. And IEEE Library 139 end up with 3 again. MD, Pi, they have 73, end up to 6, and so on, so on. Even Springer Open, they end up with to the largest majority they get is Scopus. Scopus gives them up to 20 papers. And then the smattering of all those papers. So Scopus is usually quite comprehensive. Here it almost accounts for almost half of the papers. Of course, there are places like Science Direct are very good as well. So this is the results, the numbers and the results that they report after following their procedure. Because when when we say specific, there is a process that is specified, um, which you can follow as well. You can actually redo this and come up with your own figures as well on how that literature methodology was applied. So once they collect like that, they obviously proceed to the next stage, which is comparative analysis along the main dimensions. The dimensions becomes a framework where you pick each paper and you assess it according to the dimensions. And this is very important. It's very well organized, it's very scientific, and that's the sort of literature review that you are expected to learn how to do. Right. They did a comprehensive review of all those papers, and they come up with even some results that you can see here. They come up with a table of all their dimensions. This is the table of all their dimensions, and it goes even up to the next table. But this one is a different type of table, media type distribution. Media type distribution, which is, let me see if I can enlarge this. Oh my God, this is becoming interesting. Right, interesting. Yeah, it's coming up. So this table is the media type distribution among selected papers. Things like blogs and all that stuff, you come up with all that stuff. Right, and the number of papers, of course. That, of course, you can see that in the previous page. They looked at their dimensions. They look at how many papers are in each of the categories of their research. And yeah, find how many papers are focusing on each of the areas. It's more or less statistics for their findings, for applying their methodology. So all that is important to demonstrate how specific type. And of course, I want to go into the various statistics they come up with, and also applying their filtering techniques, and also the languages across all those papers. Of course, the majority are always English papers. Then the English papers dwarf all the other languages. Of course, here you can see that there are tables that look at language. The other table is the task types in the selected papers. These are more or less sentiment analysis papers, with the majority for analyzing sentiment. That's where you get 34 papers out of the 51. And of course, the other majority is analyzing the topic, followed by analyzing sentiment. Right. So then there are very few papers on these other areas as well. So you can tell. That gives you a map what's going on in this particular area. And of course, they then go on to detailed analysis of the various tasks. So that could be very important. I'm not going into the details of that. They do provide sentiment analysis, sentiment polarities. Sentiment polarities used by selected papers, two polarities, positive and negative. Most algorithms simply say, oh, this is a positive sentiment, this is negative sentiment, or positive, neutral, negative. Yeah. Otherwise, the majority of papers just do that, which is quite something that is quite useful as well. And of course, it is possible to plot this information on a graph. In this case, you can approaches versus the number of years, right? And you can see the various development with time on across the various papers. So this is now the actual literature review where they even look at the various algorithms that come up, and that's it. So this paper, I could say, it is one of those few papers that lay out in detail what sort of methodology they follow. And the good thing about this, such writing it like that, is that someone else can pick up the methodology section and apply it to their work. And in other words, you can redo this. You could say, oh, it's a long time since these guys did this. Now we are 10 years. So we want to redo what they did and see what we come up with, what changes have happened across all the last decade. So it becomes a repeatable process. The only difference might be the time frame that you are looking at. They were looking at a certain time frame. You can take their methodology and apply it to another time frame and see what the results are, and look at the situation on the ground. So that's quite useful in terms of work. Now, right, that was the paper. Now the question is, let's look at Kitchenham. Kitchenham is the methodology that they applied. Let's look at Kitchenham. Kitchenham published a paper which you see on your screen at the moment. That paper is the one that is more or less like a guideline. It has been published in 2007, and Kitchenham is based at I don't know, with respect to these two, there is Keele University and University of Durham, both in the UK. But the primary author here is given as Keele at the bottom there. It's not. We are not quite sure whether he works at these two universities, which is quite possible. Which is quite possible. So this is the guideline document that he is interested in. I would like to. I don't want to go through the entire section. I'm only interested in specific sections that where I want, for instance, to start by looking at his definition of what a systematic literature review is, and it will be of interest to us to take a look at how they define a systematic literature review. Right, I will closely look at what they mean when they talk of a literature review. So according to Kitchenham, a systematic literature review is sometimes referred to as a systemic review. Systemic review, it basically means the same thing. It is a means of identifying, evaluating, and interpreting all available research relevant to a particular research question or research topic or phenomenon of interest, right? Now, the individual studies that are reviewed are called primary studies, and the systematic review itself is a secondary study. So that is important to note. There are times when you take secondary studies themselves and also review them, then you come up with what is called a tertiary study. So, but the systematic literature review itself is a secondary study. So they also, I mean, Kitchenham also give good reasons why you should perform one. For instance, to summarize the existing evidence concerning a treatment or a technology, and to summarize some kind of evidence, right? So to collect evidence to support a particular points and all that. The other one is to find any gaps in the current research in order to suggest areas for further investigation. This is important for those who are doing PhD and want to pick a project. Or anyone who just want to do research in a particular area. You want to research, see the gaps, so that you can also start doing work that contributes to that area. So sometimes you want to position your research activity or project within some kind of a background or context, or within some kind of a framework. So you may do a literature review on that. So he's summarizing that well. I would like to draw your attention to something that a statement that has been said by a prominent computer scientist, and that work says the indeed one of my major complaints about the computer field is that whereas Newton could say, if I have seen a little further than others, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. This quotation from Isaac Newton is well known among those who have done the sciences, but even in everyday life, this quotation is well known. But Richard is saying, I am forced to say today we stand on each other's feet. Perhaps the central problem we face in all computer science is how we are to get the situation where we build on top of the work of others rather than redoing so much of it in a trivially different way. Science is supposed to be cumulative, not almost endless duplication of the same kind of things. That quote is from Richard Hamming in 1968. I just found that to be quite something you guys should note. We need to build on the work of others. That's why we need to find gaps, how far the others have gone, and we build on top of that, so that you can say that you have stood on the shoulders of giants. And the other sciences are very good at that. So in computer science, we should also start doing that. That is the encouragement we get from these guys. Now let's look at. I don't want to look at a lot of theories because I will give you. I might share this paper or give you a link to it. But let's look at key features of the review as specified by this guideline. That could be quite useful for us. Let me see if I can tame this. If I can adjust my interestingly, I could. Right. This is some of the features of that differentiate a systematic review from a conventional expert literature review. Right? Some experts simply read literature and then write them down, which probably most of you are doing right now. Just going, collecting a number of papers and reading them without any, systematic process. But for a systematic literature review, you need a systematic process. Systematic review starts by defining a review protocol that specifies the research question being addressed and the methods that will be used to perform the review. That is very important. You saw that in the other paper by the team from Italy, from the University of Torino, if I'm correct. Then secondly, the systematic reviews are based on a defined search strategy that aims to detect as much of the literature as possible. In other words, you could then say, to the best of our knowledge, no one has done that, you know. And also, thirdly, the systematic review documents their research strategy, right? They document their research strategy so that the readers can assess their rigor and the completeness and repeatability of the process, bearing in mind that searches of digital libraries are almost impossible to replicate. But they try by all means to document the process in which they did it. You saw that in that paper. Then fourth, systematic reviews require explicit inclusion or exclusion criteria to assess each potential primary study. In other words, once you collected your literature, you need to specify why you excluded some papers and included others, right? And once you do that, once you select your core, then you must make sure that each paper is assessed and it's included in the assessment. Then last, systematic reviews, or rather, that's the fifth. The systematic reviews specify the information to be obtained from each primary study, including quality criteria by which to evaluate each primary study. In other words, these guys a dimension, and then they use that each paper is assessed according to the same aspects. And there are quality criteria as well for assessing a particular item. So you do need to take a lot of time to say, okay, each paper is like a marking scheme. It's a marking scheme, it has quality criteria and all that stuff. So it's fairly, you can even eventually score it if you do it properly. Right. Then lastly, a systematic review is a prerequisite for quantitative meta-analysis. Right. Yeah, you can quantify things and all that stuff. So that's very important. Right. So these are the key aspects I want you to understand when you're carrying out. Even when you are doing a small literature review for a research paper, you may need to do a little bit of a mini to follow through these aspects or even cover them in some way. Right now, I want to draw attention to the various types of reviews. These are they complement systematic literature reviews. For instance, systematic mapping studies. I won't go into the details of that. And also the tertiary reviews, which I have mentioned, but of course, I haven't. We don't have to discuss that. This is where you do a literature review of literature reviews, right? And then try to assess how far they gone, the methodology they used, and so on, so on. So it's important. So notice that Kicham was focusing on a literature review methodology for software engineering. Here he is comparing, of course, the, the, the differences between comparing with other areas of science, especially healthcare. And his comparison with the software engineering, 1 is perfect agreement, 0 is complete assignment. So it's a scale from 0 to 1, how these two are similar or different. Clinical medicine seems to be very, very different from software engineering, but the other domains are very similar because of the high percentage score that they gave to these studies. Now let's look at the review process. It's very important to see what the review process is for literature reviews, and I think this is something that is very important to consider. Let me see if we can cover this. can position this in such a way that we can see all the studies. Right. I think this is all the various studies. Of course, in the guideline, you see these are explained. The first stage is, of course, the planning the review. The planning process is where you identify the need for a review, commission a review, specifying the research questions, developing a review protocol, and evaluating the review protocol. That takes a lot of planning. That methodology we saw described in that paper, it takes a lot of planning. Even the dimension they came up with, it takes a lot of planning and even research as well to come up with the plan. Then conducting the review itself, you are identifying the search, selecting primary studies, study quality assessment, data extraction and monitoring, and data synthesis. Right. All these are covered in the guideline itself. And lastly, reporting the review. That's when you now have done your analysis and you're now reporting it. You specify dissemination mechanisms, formatting the main report, evaluating the report as well. Right, so that's the process that probably you could follow. Even when you conduct a small literature review, you may need to do a mini short reduced version of this approach. So that could be very important. That review process is very important. Right. The rest of the guideline, of course, explain all these the entire process, and you can see each one has got given a section in the entire guideline by Kitchenham. By Kitchenham, right? So that's what Kitchenham is saying. Of course, he is saying systematic reviews in software engineering, but generally you can apply them to computer science, and possibly it works for all these other domains, and that is very important to know that this is the case. Right. I am particularly happy that we have had a chance to cover some of these things and to explain what a literature review is. I have devoted quite a number of videos on this, and I hope you guys learn a few things relating to this aspect. I'm thinking, okay, what's our next stage? Of course, the next stage might be to actually have you guys do your literature review and have a senior researcher look at your work. I recommend literature reviews, especially for us in our research, those various groups that we have. In our groups, it might be good for us to do systematic literature reviews as a way to map the area and identify projects that we may want to do. I think that could be quite useful, especially a new area which we are defining and we want to work on. That would be very important, whether it's Internet of Things, computational linguistics, and all that stuff. So that you could apply what some of the things that I have discussed here. Right. I haven't decided yet what I might want to cover in terms of as a way to conclude this topic. This could be a very good conclusion to it because by now you have seen examples. I delivered a lecture and also covered what a literature review systematic literature review would look like. Of course, you need to keep some literature. I will compile some literature that you can read on this topic. Although you have already seen this particular paper here, that it's available online. You can search for Kitchenham systematic literature review. You can find this particular paper. It's not a big deal. Right. I think for this video, I could end here.